Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. Just to let you know, all participant lines are muted, so if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat and we can address them there. Thanks so much, and we'll be talking to you again in 2 minutes. All right, Helen, are you ready?
Yes. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Helen Duffy, and on behalf of the National High School Center, Jenny Scala and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, District and State Perspectives on Implementing RTI in Colorado High Schools.
This conference is being recorded.
Before we begin, I just want to extend our special thank you to our presenters today, Daphne Pereles, who's the Executive Director of Support and Intervention at the Colorado Department of Education, and Brenda LeBrasse, an education consultant and former district administrator who led the implementation of RTI in one Colorado district. So today what we're hoping to do is to share what we learned about high school RTI implementation. And you'll hear some of the state and district strategies that were designed to support both initial implementation and to address ongoing challenges and sustainability in the Colorado schools that we visited. Today, what I'd like to do is just begin by providing a little bit of context for the National High School Center's work in this topic area. And then we'll hear from Daphne, who will provide the state perspective on implementation, followed by Brenda and a facilitated discussion that Jenny Scala will help us with. So the work that we're going to share today really builds on a strand of work that the High School Center began back in 2007 with a report titled Meeting the Needs of Significantly Struggling Learners in High Schools, where we kind of looked at the implementation and structural issues in that RTI presents, in particular at the high school level. And explored the benefits and challenges of implementing an RTI model at the high school level. That document was followed by a collaboration with the National Center on RTI and the Center on Instruction, where we visited a number of high schools across the country to get a sense of what implementation looked like at a number of high schools. And accompanying the tiered interventions in high schools brief are some professional development tools that were developed to support implementation at the high school level. And then of course, we followed that work with this Colorado work. The work in Colorado really began in 2008 when we initially visited 2 high schools in a district in Colorado that were in the very early stages of implementing RTI. And what we decided to do was to build on that visit in 2008. We returned to the district 3 years later to learn where the schools were in their implementation and what challenges they'd faced, as well as how the state and district were supporting the work at the high school level. And what you see on the slide here are the questions that really guided our work in Colorado. And the brief that I mentioned addresses some of the questions, and you can read what we learned. But today what we're going to do really is to focus on the state and district perspectives, and so we'll be hearing now from Daphne.
Good morning or good afternoon, whichever the case may be. Just wanted to share with you a little bit about kind of what was going on at the state and how we have began our scale up, and how we continue to work on that. The first slide is really just kind of an overall view of the structure that we use for scale up in Colorado in terms of how do we provide consistent information across the state. Currently we have a regional model, and so we have regional implementation teams with both PBIS and RTI. And on our cover slide, you'll see where I actually put in parentheses MTSS because, again, we're in continual evolution, and we're currently trying to support the idea because we know the most effective practice is building models that have both RTI and both academic and behavior in the model. And they're the most sustainable. So we're trying to provide support for both at this point. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But as you can see, we have technical assistance coordinators, and they work with schools and districts in the region. And this model has evolved over time. I'll be talking a little bit about the pieces and parts of this as we go along. Our work is really based on what we learned from implementation, and again, everything we've done has informed our next step. And we base this largely on the work. We didn't know it at the time, but we do now, that we're really basing it on the work and the research that Dean Fixon and Karen Blasi have done through the State Implementation and Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practices Center. And they've been, the work that they've done and how they've allowed implementation to inform the stages of implementation have really informed us as well. None of these things existed when we started. It's kind of nice to look back and know that we did some things right. But again, as in any implementation approach, you're going to make mistakes. And so we learned from our mistakes. We adapted, modified, and adjusted everything we did along the way. Secondary implementation has always been a challenge. I think from the get-go, I think everyone agrees about that. I think that basically we know that its implementation is an iterative process, and so we have to learn from our secondary schools as we go along and allow practice to inform what we're doing. So if you look across the stages, I'll kind of walk you through some of the things we did at each stage of implementation. These stages have actually been adapted by the work in Michigan through Steve Goodman. The first stage of implementation and looking at exploration and adoption, kind of what we had going on when we first began this process, we knew that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was going to be reauthorized. It may never be again, but it was certainly being reauthorized. We knew that there were going to be some significant changes and that RTI was going to be living in the middle of that. And so in preparation for that, we put together what we call the CDE RTI Task Force, and we pulled multiple stakeholders from across the state and began to dig in on what is RTI, what does it look like, and where are effective practices happening. And so we had representation from all levels. We knew that this was not something that was just going to happen in the elementary schools, and we knew that we had to have secondary representation at that time. We also had to have representation from different fields. So we had special ed, we had general ed, we had service providers within special education, we had gifted education, we had every ed sitting at the table, and you'll see evidence of that in a minute. But we knew that in order to even begin to provide some structure at the state and some support for schools and districts to even begin implementation, that we had to get buy-in. We had to start with people knowing and understanding what RTI really was. Through this group, we actually defined what we felt like was a workable definition, and then we also identified 6 components. The 6 components really gave us some common language. The 6 components were those that we really were able to identify things that were happening within practice and being successful, and the elements that we really felt exemplified successful implementation. And so we also created a set of core principles. And so again, as we were going to move forward with developing support for schools and districts in implementation, we knew we had to get pretty tight in terms of what do we really believe, and what are those underlying beliefs that are part of RTI. The 6 components, again, just in an effort to provide that common language, because as many of you probably know, depending upon what you read, you'll get varying components, you'll get varying pieces and parts of RTI, and we knew as a state we had to kind of embrace a common way that all of our schools and districts could understand. So the 6 components that we landed on, leadership is highly significant. All of them are actually, and they're very interrelated and interdependent. Curriculum and instruction, problem-solving process, assessment, and then positive school climate and culture. And in Colorado, for over 700 of our schools, it's PBIS, and family and community partnerships. Here's our definition, and I always kind of laugh at it now because we did this back in probably 2005, and so basically it's an approach. You can see that everybody who was sitting at the table had to have their word in the definition, and it's kind of how collaboration has to start. And so we reflected every ed in our definition, and so from the beginning, Colorado's definition has not been just a deficit model. It's been a comprehensive model for educational reform, and we were very intentional about that. And so our approach has been that this is about multiple tiers to address the needs of the students that we all serve. It's about shared ownership, and it's about all kids can learn. So those are some of the underlying beliefs, and so we basically wrapped ourselves around that, and all of the guidance and support we provided was part of that. In an effort to kind of, again, begin to provide some support and to begin the scale-up process, we really began looking at how we provide all of this work we had done on the front end. How do we get that out to the field? We started with, we created a guidebook based on the work of this stakeholder group and made that available to the field. We also created a series of trainings that we conducted face-to-face across the state, regionally. And we made them working sessions. We had people coming from schools and districts in teams to sit down together to begin having conversations about their practices. And so that's how it began. We also, at the same time, or within that same, and again, this is during the installation phase, and so when you're looking at installation, you're beginning to set up some infrastructures. You're beginning to establish your teams and your data systems and things like that. And so what we did is we wanted to provide as much information during this stage, and we created a video that really, again, embraced the 6 components. It was very general in nature, but we were very intentional about including secondary in this. Actually, the National High School Principal of the Year was in actually Brenda's district, and we brought her in to be interviewed for this video. We thought it was very important that the voice of secondary be there from the beginning. And we also created a series of tools to help schools and districts make decisions about what to do next, because, again, with this huge implementation, it was kind of like we didn't know what we didn't know, and we set up a series of questions that these tools included a series of questions that allowed them to reflect on their own practices and what they could do to change, what kinds of professional development they needed, what kinds of resources they had within their own building. And a lot of times we found like that it hadn't even occurred. People didn't even know what resources they had and the teachers they had working in the building. And so it was even just starting as simple as that. Then basically, again, we went through this whole process of, we called it leadership training, but it was really kind of our initial run around the state around what is RTI, how can we field questions, and what tools can we put in the hands of administrators to begin the process of change. We also created brochures. We knew that the families and communities, it was going to be very important to bring them in early on. We created a brochure that kind of in bullet points kind of describes some of the shifts and changes, from what was to what we were going to be building in terms of RTI. Again, trying to give schools and districts enough support to make it happen. And then our law changed with Exceptional Children's Education Act once IDEA was reauthorized. We were one of the first 5 states in the country to get rid of the discrepancy model in terms of specific learning disability classification, and we really had to do a pretty thorough job of support there, thinking about what schools and districts were going to need to make such a big shift. We used the discrepancy model, and so moving from that into this body of evidence model for identification really required all hands on deck, and so we had to do a lot of work around that. But it also gave us some leverage, and it allowed us to have conversations because and for change to occur because legislation was supporting. Then, in addition, we created internally at our State Department a cross-departmental team, and we call it Colorado RTI. It still exists today. We are continually reflecting on our own work and work from the field and bringing it in. So we change and adapt our support. We also had a new commissioner come in, and he had done RTI implementation within his district and really embraced it. He sent a letter to all superintendents when he came in saying, you have to identify an RTI contact within your district. And that made it so much easier. We began to develop lines of communication for the work, and we created some, which allowed us to have a very systematic approach. And then we also created a problem-solving video around that time. And again, we really felt like we were in the initial implementation stages. We were really beginning to start to dig into some of the components that needed to be stood up. And then as we began to elaborate and moving into elaboration and kind of moving some of that work out a little bit further and with more depth, we created some regional RTI cadres. So those RTI contacts within districts then began to come together in regions and have conversation about implementation. By this time, they had been implementing for a couple of years and trying to get, and that might have been around 2008 when that first high school visit happened with this center, and so we were really just kind of creating venues for discussion around implementation because we knew there were challenges. And secondary was almost always a topic of interest in every single one of our regional cadres. I mean, it was because it was such a challenge, and it was such a different beast. It really is, and it has different variables, and so it's much harder to do. And so we also created some online classes around each of those components, and we created at that point in time a secondary implementation video. Because, again, because secondary had been such a topic in every single area of the state, we felt like it was important that we identified schools and districts that were actually doing a really good job of this and felt like they were beginning to get it and implement well, and capture some of those voices and share them. And that's what we did with this secondary video. And that is actually, by the way, accessible. We have it online. All of our videos and materials are at our website, which is, we can send that to you, but it's www.cde.state.co.us. So /RTI. So all of our tools are up there, and this video, which has actually been well received, is also available. We also created, again, how do you begin to evaluate your own system, how well you're doing, getting that continuous improvement thinking within systems. We created a comprehensive evaluation tool, which we've now sort of evolved into more implementation rubrics. We also have a family and community partnership toolkit, and we're really hitting that one pretty heavily now. We're doing a lot of training with that. It's a great toolkit, really shifts the thinking about how to bring families in as partners. And I'm going to type the website into the chat notes as soon as I'm done getting through my slides. That sounds like a good plan. The other thing that we had to consider was kind of, as we began if you're going to talk about implementation, you have to talk about fidelity, and you have to, and it was really not a good word. People didn't like hearing that one. But we really felt like it was important to look at the extent to which an intervention or approach is implemented and was intended or designed. So overall fidelity of implementation of RTI was important, not to mention the individual interventions that were occurring within the context of that. But the benefits of looking at fidelity is that, it clarifies expectations and helps people reach their implementation goals. It allows you to establish those baselines and, show growth, and basically it allows you focus. It just gives you, because RTI is just so big that you kind of have to have areas of focus. And so what fidelity allows you to do is really get areas of focus where you need to grow. With that, we really wanted to, these were things we took into consideration as we really evolved into these implementation rubrics that we created. And we began to talk as we went out in the field, and we spent a lot of time with schools and districts, school and district teams across the state, and we were intentional about making it pre-K all the way through 12th grade. And I was amazed at some of the things that I saw high schools doing. I was very excited. So the screening data, how it was being used to inform schedules and things like that, it was very exciting to see. But we also heard pretty consistently that if you're going to look at fidelity, you have to have flexibility. And we're a local control state, and many of you probably know what that means. We get a lot of pushback, and and a lot of discussions around, well, our kids are very unique, and that's the beauty of RTI, is that you can actually, make a system that meets the needs of your kids, which is really the intent of it. And so what we know is that the flexibility has to be there to address the circumstances, conditions, and needs that vary from site to site. So we also know that implementation is going to look different in different sites. And it's very clear. We've learned that very clearly from implementation. But our objective in designing our fidelity of implementation tool was that we wanted something that was going to actually respect professionals, was going to honor the context and circumstances that existed, that allowed adaptive innovations, because we saw so many different things that were working in one place that may not work in another, and we knew there had to be some flexibility in there. And also tools that would allow ownership to develop. Shared ownership is key to RTI implementation and the effectiveness. It also integrated, we were looking for a tool that would integrate practice with context. We know that you can talk about elements of RTI, but you always have to go back to the context of how it exists. And it also allows for sustainability. We wanted the tool to be able to have some consistency so that as you're trying to sustain all these efforts, it's done in a very consistent manner. So that really pushed this, the development of these tools has really pushed us into continuous improvement regeneration. It's very exciting what is happening. We began to write in teams, and that community of practice, that Colorado community of practice, actually wrote the rubrics. So our standards implementation team was involved. We had people from across the department in the title programs, in our ELL programs, involved in writing these rubrics. And it was directly informed from the field. And so, again, we took voices from the field and brought it in. That summer, we had something that they could respond to. We brought in 10 districts. And one of the questions was about secondary. Do you feel like these tools would be useful at the secondary level? Because our intent was that they would be. So we got feedback. We adapted and modified them. We actually created a set of tools that we have a set of classroom tools, a set of school, and then district-level tools. Again, with that notion that all of our systems need to be speaking the same language, we have to have the common understanding of implementation. And this year, we have been piloting with these rubrics in 109 of our schools just to validate the instrument. We still have a lot of work to do, but we're very, very excited about our preliminary results and the feedback that we're getting from the field. The exciting part is that by creating these rubrics, we were able to kind of then tag into some of the other work going across the department, which kind of gave more oomph to RTI implementation. And our state has what we call a unified improvement plan, and it's part of our accountability system. And every school and district has to write one. What these schools are finding is that these rubrics are helping them develop action plans about what to do next, in order to create these effective systems. And so the rubrics have been an integral part of that. And educator effectiveness rubrics right now, we're in the process, and I'm sure many of you and some of your states are also having educator effectiveness rubrics developed. And so our rubrics were already created for RTI, and they were actually used in the development of our principal and educator rubrics, which is exciting. And so therefore there's a connection, and things are really starting to come together. Dots are being connected. It's kind of exciting. And then we also have, for our really struggling schools and districts, we have a review process. It's been in place and it's been pretty solid, but it was needing revision. And we've worked very closely with them along with our rubrics, to integrate that work. And so that's some of the continuous improvement regeneration work that we're doing. I'll share with you a little bit of preliminary data that we've gathered utilizing our implementation rubrics. You can see that and again, I'm going to send you that, I'm going to write that website, because all the rubrics are also online. We wrote them, obviously, again, using our structure of the 6 components. Probably along the way we might have wanted to change 1 or 2, but we really felt like once we committed to the 6, we kind of had to stick with it. And so we've just evolved those 6. So again, it's important to stay with the common structure. So you can see the 6 components. This is data that is from across all 109 schools that we've collected. It's kind of our baseline, and it's across 15 districts. And this is the comprehensive data. And from the data, these are the stages of implementation here. So you can see we have emerging, developing, operationalizing, and optimizing. And those are the levels on the rubric. And so, and obviously, you want to get as close to optimizing as possible. By the time you're optimizing, you're doing things as a matter of course. Things are happening naturally. The structures are in place to make your implementation pretty solid. And so, if you look at the data, it's really kind of interesting. Obviously, this is an area, family and community partnerships, that we've identified as an area we are focusing on right now. I think I mentioned earlier we're doing our work around the toolkit, and we're doing that across the state right now. So if you look at the data, I think it's just really helpful. The other area was problem solving. So those are the two areas that we're kind of hitting right now. And then I actually had our data guy disaggregate the secondaries. And so we've got baseline and pilot data from 44 secondary schools. So they're middle or high schools, and there's one K-12 in there in the 15 districts. And the data's just slightly different. Look at problem solving. I mean, it's clearly a need, and that's really understandable at the high school level. You know, what data do you bring together? I think I mentioned before that we also do PBIS. What we're learning is that we've actually engaged in parallel play around PBIS implementation and RTI implementation. And what we're finding now is that we want to merge that so that it's really one comprehensive system, that we're not separating out behavior and looking at it in a different way than we would academics. And so we're really working hard at that. And problem solving is key to that. So we're really focusing, both our PBIS folks and our RTI folks are working very closely together to create a problem solving class that we can really use as a way to kind of pull and merge that academic and behavior data together. And then the family and community, again, continues to be an area. Assessment is also one of interest as well. But you can just see kind of, and again, this is very preliminary. We haven't done a whole lot of analysis, but I'm kind of excited by what we see, and that these tools will be kind of fun to play with down the road. I think that it will really help us all in terms of where we need to focus. And with that, I believe that's my last slide, and I'm going to type in our website.
Actually, Jenny has it in the Q&A box.
Oh, good, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
well,
Brenda.
Good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are located. And I just wanted to introduce myself. I was originally the Executive Director of Curriculum and Instruction in the School District 11 in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and was also the Director of RTI and was given the responsibility and leadership to make sure that RTI was fully embedded in 100% of our schools in the district. And at the time that I took on that responsibility, there were 60 schools in the school district, and that was just the center-based core schools. There was also the digital high school and the high schools that met at night, and those schools as well that we included in our original introduction to the implementation of RTI. So I'm going to go through on my slides and talk about the implementation of RTI in the school district in which I was the Executive Director of Curriculum and Instruction. I just recently retired last year, and this year I am doing RTI on a consulting basis. So as Daphne had talked about the MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support, we also call it the multi-tiered model of instruction and intervention, which, as we all know, is response to intervention. So when you look at, and we all know, the three levels, the intensive level, the strategic level, and the universal level, that this is about all students. and it's about talking about all students at that universal core level of instruction, where you ask yourself, you ask the teachers, you ask the schools, what research-based, high-quality general education is going on for all students 100% of the time. And while doing that, you incorporate what universal screening you're using, what progress monitoring you're using, what type of prescriptive assessments in order to design your instruction, particularly in secondary schools. And the expectations should be taught, monitored, and reinforced. It is when those students on an everyday basis that struggle that you start to look at the strategic level, which has been identified as 5 to 15% of the students. Are they at risk of academic or social challenges? How do we identify them? What processes do we use? And then what do we do to give them the additional specific supports that they need in order to succeed? And then at the very top of the pyramid is the intensive level, which we know is 1 to 5% of the students who are going to need some additional support, intensive academic or behavioral support, and that has to be looked at and based on ongoing progress monitoring and diagnostic support. The main thing that high schools struggle with in this model, and everybody understands it, is how do you schedule that into your everyday so that you hit the universal level, the strategic kids, and the intensive level without making it a pull-out. So when we were implementing and looking at our elementary schools, our middle schools, and our high schools, because it was done throughout the district, we had to look at the number of high schools, and we broke it into stages of implementation. Originally, we had an adoptive readiness stage, which was really no RTI. It was like that particular school had struggled through the development and implementation of RTI. And then the initial implementation was that schools were beginning to implement based upon the rubrics that the district had developed, and we went in to observe those schools and give them feedback. We called the schools that were in best practice those that particularly had a routine use. They knew exactly what the 6 stages or the 6 components were. They implemented them on a routine basis throughout the implementation. And then the Exemplar sites, which the high schools primarily struggled with the most, those were what we called the institutionalized. It was a practice that was never going to go away. It was thoroughly developed and implemented into those sites. So we had a way that we went in, as I said, and we used a rubric. We developed a way to give feedback on what schools needed to improve upon, and we gave to the school board, who was very involved in the implementation of RTI in the school district, what we called a heat chart, so that they knew each school by name, and it was color-coded by the 6 components and where each school was at. So they could go in and actually ask certain questions and look at the rubric themselves when they went in to visit schools. So we gave a program implementation status update report that last year that I was there in the spring of 2011, and the district again did that this fall to see where the schools were at. Were they holding on to the rating that they had? Had they slipped in their rating as far as the 6 components that Daphne described, and what needed to be done to assist them? And as I explained it, there was actually a heat chart that identified the leadership component, the curriculum and instruction component, the problem-solving component, the data and assessment component, and the climate component, which we considered PBIS, and then the family and community component. So they were then identified by whether they were exemplar sites, best practice, initial implementation, or, like I said, the adoption readiness or non-use. Then the executive director of RTI, which at that time was myself, and the staff that I had to assist with, would develop what the schools needed in the next year in order to strengthen any of the areas that were identified. And as Daphne had pointed out, problem solving was always a needs assessment for our high schools particularly and our middle schools, as well as the family and community component. So in leadership, what we found out, and the National High School Center pointed out in the article, the most recent article, when they went in to look at the 3 high schools in our district, was that leadership is primary in implementing RTI. It plays an important role in showing other stakeholders how RTI can help make sense of other school improvement and student support initiatives. So in both the state of Colorado and in School District 11, we provided the multi-tiered model of instruction and intervention strategies and led that throughout the leadership, the principal leadership, the assistant principal leadership, whoever was going to make sure that this was implemented in all of our schools. So in our rubric under leadership, we included school-wide understanding and focus. We included professional development, school-wide planning, and resource commitment, and principal involvement was primary in the leadership piece. Then we looked at curriculum and instruction, and as we moved through from 2004, when RTI was originally looked at in School District 11, and there were pilot sites, all the way up to 2007, where 100% of the sites were implementing all 6 major components of RTI. We then looked at curriculum instruction, not only from the high-quality standards-based instruction at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, but what interventions were being used, what processes were in place, the fidelity of the use, which Daphne described, because the fidelity of how these interventions and the fidelity of how Core 1 instruction was being taught was critical in the implementation of RTI. But as we also looked at the instructional scheduling of how the school was able to place the students in the intervention and the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 interventions, it's also what kind of data they collected on that, and as well as the curriculum over the years changed and the standards changed, we had to make sure that that was being implemented into the RTI pieces of curriculum and instruction. School climate and culture, as Daphne had mentioned, School District 11 decided that instead of making PBIS a separate component, that it was going to now become part of what we called school climate and culture in the RTI pieces. So as we worked with the schools and we worked with the pyramid of interventions, we also included in that the school climate and culture, which was the PBIS. So we had people that were working with the schools, primarily centering around the climate and the culture, because they're so closely linked together that we had to include it in the rubric. We had a way that we looked at the rates of violating behavior was minimized. We had a way to look at the pro-social behavior. We had a way that we looked at the continuum of PBIS and how students were academically engaged and how achievement was maximized by focusing and concentrating on changing any of the school climate and culture. problem-solving team process, we primarily used the CDE video, and we went through stages of teaching the secondary schools what problem-solving processes really look like, because in a high school, the problem-solving process may look different at the 9th grade and 10th grade than it would at the 11th and the 12th grade. So when we worked at the high schools, we primarily had to look at what was the problem-solving process, who would be involved in it in the 9th and the 10th grade, and who would be involved in it in the 11th and the 12th grade, because the assessment data used and the different screening tools used might be different according to 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, and 12th graders, and then had to look at what teachers would be involved and when they could all get together to discuss student achievement and what would they be looking at? Would they be looking at grades? Would they be looking at attendance? Would they be looking at the tests that maybe a core group of teachers would be giving at one time, particularly in 9th or 10th grade if there was an academy that that school had implemented. And then we had to look at assessment and the use of data. And again, we had to look at it through our rubric that we had, and we had to look at what screening tools did we use at the high school level for assessing what students were going to need Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, particularly in reading and math when they were struggling at 9th and 10th grade. And then what assessments and use of data would we use at the higher levels at 11th and 12th grade, universal screening data, what type of data dialogues will we have teachers interacting, and then what would we use for our progress monitoring tools, how will we use short cycle diagnostic assessments, and then how would we use the gap analysis. So all of this needed to be a staff development process, and schools would be in discussions together and at their sites to discuss what they were going to use. The district identified the screening tools, the progress monitoring tools for the entire district at each level. And then family and community involvement. How would we get not only the families and the community involved at the sites, but how do we get, as a district, the family and communities involved so that the district had its policies formally identified so that no matter what students were in any of our schools, we were able to talk the same talk and show the same things and processes no matter whether they were in the elementary, the middle, or the high schools. So again, as Daphne had pointed out, and I'm showing you the summary of the 6 components in not only the Colorado State implementation rubrics guidelines, but in the one that we used in our district, centered around leadership, curriculum and instruction, school climate and culture, problem-solving process, assessment and use of data, and family and community involvement. The school board was involved, which I'm going to get into here in a minute, and they asked on a continual basis how each site was in their implementation and their fidelity of that implementation for each of these components. So we looked at the activities. We identified the activities that we would go in and look at when we were assessing each of our schools. We then, as I said before, we divided it up into adoption readiness sites, initial implementation sites, best practice sites, and exemplar sites. We had a process where the sites that were identified as best practice and exemplar were used as our models for our other sites. So if someone in the adoption readiness wanted to go see and observe what the other sites had in best practice and exemplar, they were able to do that and learn from one another. We also had visitors come in from out of state. We had visitors come in from other districts who wanted to see particularly an elementary site that was in best practice or exemplar, a middle school site, and a high school site. So one of the things that we learned when we implemented RTI into the district was that it was critical to get the school board involved. And to not do that would never have helped us get to where we got to, because the school board not only was trained in what RTI was, but fully understood the importance of why that made every student in their district successful at all of their sites. So we implemented not only a school board policy over time, which went into effect in 2008, but we also explored and provided the financial support needed to begin the initial implementation of that. So when the school board identified, we find that RTI is so critical to the success of this district and to our students, we're going to put $500,000 in a fund for the 100% implementation of RTI in this district. Then the school board got involved in a district leadership team, and that was another critical thing. We combined RTI, and at that time it was called PBS. Now it's PBIS, but we combined them together, and we pulled in critical people from all over the district, from school sites, from district sites. The school board was involved, and we met twice a month to begin with, and then later, as the years went on, at the fourth year, we narrowed it down to one time a month. We met after school, and it was a very critical team, and it was always around 30 people that would meet together to discuss where are we with the implementation of both RTI and PBIS in the district. They would look at the heat charts. They would discuss the schools. The principals would be there. And this was one of the main things I would say in any district that is critical to look at for the implementation of the fidelity of RTI. And then we had short and long-term goals. So the school board had short and long-term goals. The district leadership team had short and long-term goals. And we would look over those, monitor them, discuss them, and put other priorities as we saw a need as we moved through the years of the full implementation of RTI in the district. And then we had to look at how do we build the capacity and the sustainability? Because as you know, as leaders move through an organization or move through the school system, which again is in the article that the National High School Center wrote about the 3 high schools that they looked at in our district, the primary thing is as one principal moves on, how do you build that capacity and how do you embed it into the system so that the sustainability stays no matter who leads that school or who leads that organization? So we began with implementing the board policy, which is still in effect. We explored the financial support, and the school board provided that. Not only did the school board get involved in the district leadership teams, but principals got involved, teachers got involved, special education, social workers. We had counselors, a whole gamut of people. We had parents involved in that. We monitored the short and long-term goals. We monitored the rubrics and the implementation of fidelity of how it was done, and then we built the capacity and the sustainability. So the main priority in the school board policy was that 100% of the sites would be fully implemented in RTI. And not only that, as you move from elementary to middle to high school, the processes, the procedures, the use of the rubrics was fully a formalized process, so it did not look differently in each of the sites. Now, it would look differently in an elementary site to a high school site, but overall, by level, it all looked formally, the processes looked the same. We established a timeline, and like I said, this is a timeline based on Fixon, and as you know, it begins with exploration and it ends with sustainability. So in 2004, when the research came out, and that's when the district began the pilot sites to determine whether to implement, that's when the thorough research was being done for the district. In 2007 was when the actual installation, where the full implementation of all the sites began, and the team building, the planning, the organization all began. Then the initial implementation is where the rubber meets the road. That was around 2008. And then all 6 components were fully installed by 2009. The improvements were then made to the current practices. Innovation occurred, and then sustainability occurred over the process of 2010 to 2011. So the school level feedback form, when we gave feedback to the sites on areas that they needed to improve upon based on the rubric, and they were part of the process of the rubric. We didn't go in and evaluate the school without the problem-solving team with us and the leadership team of the school with us. And it was based on those 6 key component areas that I talked about. The district personnel was involved, which was their executive director of school leadership was part of the process. We talked about their strengths, and we talked about areas of concern, which became their next steps. And we overall gave them a ranking by those 6 components. So the district did develop pilot exemplar sites that I was explaining earlier that other sites were able to go and learn from and also go to see them and model things after them. A lot of times schools would go to see the problem-solving teams. We had to determine research-based interventions and instructional best practices so that it was a formal process throughout the entire district, and then provide that ongoing professional development. We had to ensure that Fidelity was in all of what we did. We had to identify a dynamic pyramid of interventions. Each school had their own pyramid of interventions that they made as a staff, and the staff understood that. We created the district leadership team. We identified any of the appropriate assessments by level. We identified the appropriate resources that were needed, and we set goal teams and PLCs around those expectations. The RTI Colorado State model, when, as Daphne said, that was mandated, this was the diagram that was used in our district to explain each tier and each level, because it seemed as if we needed something that everybody could understand together. So as I was explaining before, in Tier 1, you have your universal differentiated core instruction, and that's for all students. What people need to understand is as you monitor the degree of unresponsiveness to an intervention or to the core instructional program, those students need additionally 45 minutes at a minimum of 4 times a week for a strategic intervention. So that's not an instead of program, that's in addition to. And then as they need additional intervention to that particular strategic intervention, they may go to Tier 3, which is then again an additional 30 minutes. and that should be 5 times a week. The hard part for high schools is to figure out how do you do that given the amount of time in a day and what the students need for graduation. How do you fit that into a schedule? And that's the part that becomes tricky for the high school when you're adding on an additional 45 minutes and then an additional 30 minutes. At the very highest, after Tier 3, those would be the students that you look at maybe for SLD or for gifted and talented, and you would use some focused assessments to determine the intensity of the treatment for those students. Some of the sample implementation tools that are available come from these websites, the RTI Assessment and Progress Monitoring Guidelines, and then the Pyramid of Instruction and Intervention District Endorsed, Required, and Supported. And those websites are on here. So some of the next steps a district would look at is how do we continue the training once RTI is in all the sites and it's been embedded and the systems seem to be in place, although there's always constantly a changing of leadership in our schools. How do we continue the training? How do we continue the coaching? How do we continue to facilitate best practice sharing of our sites? And how do we implement those into our school action plans? And then how do we refine our tools to define what we consider to be best practice processes? How do we adopt the electronic tools that support both RTI and PBIS? And then how do we identify and fund effective interventions? Because we're talking about systems and a district system. So some of the ongoing work would be the standard protocol interventions that will be used at elementary, at middle, and at high school. The progress monitoring tools that would be used, how often would they be done at each level? How are we going to use the data? How do we have data dialogues and PLCs around discussion of this data? How do we make sure that the interventions are done with Fidelity? Again, positive behavior intervention is not separate from RTI, but is critically a component and an integral part of RTI. And then how do we continue to educate and train? So additional challenges that always districts will look at is continuing that sustainability, using differentiated Tier 1 instructional practices, training in the use of benchmarking tools, discussion around how often do we progress monitor? What does the progress monitoring look like? How do you progress monitor in 9th grade and in 10th grade set differently from 11th and 12th grade? And how effective are these interventions that we are using? Because we don't want to continue to use interventions that aren't working and that aren't showing progress. How do we schedule? How do we give high school course credits to students who are in Tier 2 and Tier 3? And then how do we continue to staff develop all of our teachers?
Well, thank you, Brenda. Hi, everyone. This is Jenny Scala with the National High School Center. We wanted to take a few minutes to have some discussion between Brenda and Daphne based on some of the information that they've hinted at in their presentations that we can go a little bit more in depth on, and we're going to combine that with asking Daphne and Brenda some of the questions that participants submitted while they were registering for today's session. But before we get into some of those participant questions, I did want to ask both Brenda and Daphne to speak a little bit to the second point. And Brenda, you talked a little bit right at the end about alignment of other initiatives like PBIS with the RTI work. But I was wondering if, Brenda, you don't mind starting about if there were other areas that you made sure from the district perspective that there were resources that were aligned or other initiatives that really helped move the response to intervention and instruction work forward within the district?
Well, one of the main things was that school districts a lot of times will ask schools to create action plans depending on what initiative is going on. So if you're an AVID site, Advancement via Individual Determination, you might have an action plan for AVID. You might have an action plan for PBS. You might have an action plan for RTI, and then you have your school improvement action plan. And what drives teachers crazy and school leaders crazy is how do you implement all of the components of each of those action plans into one action plan, so that the leader, and I, as you said, Jenny, I hinted at it earlier, the leader has the process to include in the school-wide improvement plan all of the other components, and so that teachers are able to see it's all one alignment, that where the school is going is aligned with all of this together. RTI doesn't sit separate from everything else.
And so just as a quick follow-up, Brenda, then before I have Daphne answer the same question, then when you were talking and going out with the leaders, was there encouragement from the district level to think of that almost alignment and to think about them as building blocks rather than separate, isolated plans?
Yes, it became very apparent. And in fact, the district had created a template that the schools could use so that they could talk using RTI language, using what do you do in Tier 1, differentiated instruction? What do you do in Tier 2 for interventions for students? So that no matter what level, what school improvement plan, whatever level we were working with, they embedded all of that language and all of the school improvement processes together.
Great. And Daphne, how about from the state perspective of alignment of resources at the state level as well as state-led initiatives?
Well, I think I mentioned in my part, kind of the state has really created what we call a unified improvement plan, and it's exactly what Brenda's referring to. It's, we used to ask districts to write any of a number of plans, and it was like, if you were a title district, you had to write one plan. If you were, you had all of these different plans, special ed, you had all these different plans that you had to do. Now, with this unified improvement plan, we've pulled it all together. And so there's now a way to look comprehensively at your system and to make decisions based on data, again, which is so important in terms of RTI implementation, that you're continually making decisions that are based on the data that you have. And so we're really spending a lot of time standing that up, and again, RTI is smack in the middle of it. It's like Brenda said, it's not a separate thing. You can't, it's really been directly connected to school and district improvement. And so being able to really dig in on that, and then having a structure like our 6 components, what we're finding is that it's very helpful to have the rubrics to look at when you're talking about the what to do part. So you analyze your data, you find out where your breakdowns are, and then you can actually match your needs to what the rubrics are telling you also, about what you need to do next for your system. And so it's really changed. I think we're in our 3rd year now of this UIP thing. It's because we have to review all of them at the state level. It's a pretty intensive process, but I think it's really changing practice, and I think it's giving systems an opportunity to look systemically. And so we're trying to align all of the work that we're doing at the state level. So like I mentioned, educator effectiveness, everything, we're trying so hard not to have there's so many moving parts right now in education, and we're trying so hard to connect the dots so that it doesn't feel like more. And RTI is right in the middle of all of that. And RTI is almost a connector to all of that.
Great. We had several questions that were submitted by participants around culture and thinking about ways to go about changing culture at various levels within the education system to be more aligned in terms of thinking about more of this response to intervention and instruction framework of supporting students, additional supports, additional kind of database decision making, and just wondering what was done or could have been done to really have a more or a direct kind of impact on changing the culture at both the state and district level.
So can you just repeat the last part now?
Sure. What was done or could have been done to help change the culture at the state and district level to support the implementation of response to intervention?
Yeah, well, I think that I think both Brenda and I gave you a ton of different examples about. You probably heard pretty consistently from both of us that it involves stakeholder involvement. You absolutely can't do anything without it, and that's really what we were intentional about, both at the district level, and I think Brenda even talked about the importance of the board and all of that. Same here at the state level. We have a state board of ed. Same kind of a deal. We have to communicate with them and get their support. We created some structures internally. We try to practice what we preach. It's not always easy at the state level. And we created structures within, we're still working at it. We're not perfect, believe me. We're far from it. But we put some systems in place, such as that community of practice I talked about that we have here internally, where we talk about everything RTI, because regardless of what, given that there's a mandate and systems were having to shift, we knew that all of us across the whole department, depending on what we were doing, we were all out in the field doing different things, but we all saw RTI happening in various and sundry ways, and we could bring that information back and have conversations about it, and so as a department. And that's really what that structure provided. And I think it's really, we've been doing that. I think we're starting we're in 4 years we've been doing that. And it has made such a difference for the work and what we've been able to do at the state. And then I think that that's given the message of multi-tiers and multi-tier approaches to the whole department. We actually wrote our, as part of that ECEA waiver team, and, we basically built our whole state system on tiers. So it's kind of like, what are we going to do for those districts that have intensive needs? So we use the structure across our whole department now. It's really kind of neat. And so there have been opportunities to have some of those things happen. So I think there's evidence of it everywhere, but we really had to be intentional about building structures to change our practice. Otherwise, we just go back and keep doing what we do,
Great, thanks. Brenda?
Well, do I have to press star 7, or can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Some of the things, we did like a survey specifically around climate and culture of schools. The district did. And some of the things that the district centered on and looked at and was part of our rubric was, did the school have a formal, positive behavioral program in place that focused on every single classroom, lunchrooms, hallways, restrooms, and was it a school-wide organizational structure? And were we able to identify that when we came into it, into the school? And then did the school actually teach behavior expectations? And did they constantly utilize a common language for acknowledging and responding to behavior? Did they have expectations posted in their hallways? Did the students know what those expectations were? Were they taught by classroom teachers? Were they taught by administrators? How did the administrators and teachers correct the behavior when it needed to be corrected? That's the positive piece. How were kids acknowledged, and teachers even acknowledged if they had done positive things? What were their support systems that they had in place for that positive recognition? How did they review their data? Did they know and have a process for analyzing areas of the building where particular things would occur, incidents would occur, and how did they go about correcting that if that was identified in data analysis? How often did they look at their data, and how often did they review their behavioral data? How did they educate their parents, and how did they educate their school community about their positive behavior support system? And how did they include the parents in that? And then how did they document anything that they did around their positive behavioral support system? So there was some pretty strict, formalized ways that we would go in and identify and have expectations around that climate and culture in our buildings.
Great. And the next question that was submitted by a participant, I'm going to ask Brenda to answer. And it was really around existing state policy and wondering if there was any state policy that was inhibiting the efforts at the district. And then a follow-up question of what actions could a state legislature take to make implementation at the district level be a little bit easier?
Well, we work closely with the state. So there was nothing that the state had ever done that inhibited our process. Everything the state did actually accentuated what we were doing, because even though we developed our rubrics ahead of the state, when Daphne had pointed out there were districts involved that summer in looking at the rubrics, changing the rubrics. They added the classroom piece that our district didn't even have. Our district was involved in all of that. And so everything that the state did aligned itself very well with the district. And I personally felt that when the commissioner came in and told every superintendent that this was a priority and that the superintendent had to identify in every district in the state of Colorado someone who was going to make sure that RTI was put in place in that district, that really accentuated and helped every single district in our state. And then when the mandate came through for the state of Colorado that the discrepancy model wouldn't be used anymore, that just kind of, surfaced as that was perfect, because now multi-tiered systems of support was going to have to be in all of our districts and in all of our sites.
Great. And Daphne, would you add anything about how the state legislature could help facilitate implementation of RTI?
Yeah, I have a pretty good view from here. So it's interesting, how legislation is passed and how RTI has made its way into some of the legislation. And I think, as Brenda said, I think that it's, we've just been doing it. We've been doing the work, and therefore it ends up in legislation. This year, for example, we had a pretty large literacy bill that was passed. Colorado has not really put a lot of money toward that in the past, and it's really a big bill, and RTI smack in the middle of it. Interventions, progress monitoring, and it's an early literacy bill. There's professional development and all that, but it's all part of that, and we were actually asked to read it and respond and things like that, so that was all good. And again, because we had created materials, they had something to draw from, because we've defined what we think RTI is, and we have a definition, and they worked from that definition So it does get its way in there. Of course, I think it's in legislation. I think we have been pretty bold in terms of legislation, but as Brenda said, we were very careful to make sure that we provided the support that our schools and districts needed to do this right. When we changed, we knew the legislation around SLD was going to be a big deal when IDEA was reauthorized, and so what we did is special ed directors across the state said, we can't do this tomorrow. This is a huge change in practice, and we agreed. We allowed each district to submit a plan, an implementation plan, and we provided a template, and it was aligned with the six components, and the ones that directly applied to SLD determination. So each district could write their own plan, and we collected all of those and reviewed them and provided any support that districts might have needed. Then we immediately kicked in any training. So it's just kind of those kinds of things. But so we've already really seen evidence of how RTI has gotten into legislation. I think that for us, it's and again, it's in our accountability bill as well. So it's already there. It's kind of exciting.
Great. And then I wanted to see what advice you would both be willing to share with other state departments or districts that are beginning similar efforts. Since you've been fairly successful, you guys have a great kind of knowledge and experience with it. What would you share in terms of advice to other folks who are just beginning similar efforts?
I brought this up. I think that district-wide, I think it's critical that they include the school board in the process because there's a strength behind the school board that they actually become the advocates for the students and the parents, and they'll bring in the resources that are needed if they see the importance behind it and they feel like they're part of the implementation process. And the other thing I think, Daphne will probably go along with this as far as when you're looking at the implementation by site and she's looking at the implementation by district, I think that it's critical that the fidelity of the way schools implement the processes, the formal processes that have been identified by the use of a rubric is important. So that the way I look at it is the state will eventually put the processes in place similarly no matter what district you're in. And I think that that's critical if you're going to look at the success of students throughout an entire state.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that I think you can tell that we've both at the district and state level, we've worked hard to create partnerships to pull this off. And it can't be, and I think I heard Brenda say this earlier, you can't build systems that are going to be people dependent. And so we have worked hard to create structures that will exist, without the people who are leading, you know what I mean? And so because of that, we've worked hard to pull in stakeholders, and families are crucial. Families and parents are crucial to this initiative. And so we just have partnerships with that group. The other thing that I would suggest, based on information we've gathered from schools and districts in terms of implementation, every single one of them has said, we didn't know what we didn't know. We thought we were doing a really good job implementing what we were doing. We thought we were doing a good job of school. We thought we were educating our kids. Thought, yes, we knew our graduation rates were X, Y, or Z, but we really thought we were doing a good job. Our hearts were in it. We were invested in kids, the whole 9 yards. It wasn't until we began to implement RTI that we realized that we could do more with our universal tier, that we could do more for all kids. And because what happened was everybody started adding interventions, and they had so many interventions that they were serving a large percentage of their population when they realized they could be doing more for all kids and having fewer interventions. So they knew they needed to beef up their universal tier. That was a pretty consistent message across the state, and it just very, very interesting. So that's the message from schools and districts in terms of implementation.
Great. So I want to thank both of you guys for taking the time. What I'm going to do now is go over a little bit about how we're hoping to continue this conversation. I know Helen and I always love speaking with Brenda and Daphne and always feel like the time just slips away from us. And so given that, what the National High School Center has done is we've actually created an online community of practice. And today's event was basically the kickoff of a week of events of what we're hoping will take place on our online community of practice, and we've posted in both the chat box as well as the Q&A the link for the online community of practice. It's also here on the slides, and I want to point out that we will be posting the archived webinar along with the slides on both the community of practice website as well as the National High School Center's website. And there's some benefits of visiting us on the community of practice, which I want to walk through right now as well. So starting on Monday, what we're going to have is some discussion threads focused on the tiered interventions page, focused on today's webinar. And you'll also, as you explore the site, see that there are some discussions already on topics that have been mentioned pretty thoroughly in the Q&A, specifically around scheduling. We do have a discussion thread focusing on scheduling. We're also going to start a new discussion thread just asking people to upload examples of schedules. We know that that's something that people in the field are always interested in, seeing how other schools are really maximizing the time that they have within their schedules to allow for that stronger Tier 1, as Daphne was talking about, really kind of focusing on that Tier 1, but also then providing those secondary and tertiary levels of supports. So throughout the week, you can post questions and comments on that discussion page specifically for today's webinar. And then next Thursday, Helen and I will be hosting at 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time an online chat based on the Colorado brief that was published earlier this year in March. And beyond that, the Community of Practice does have additional events, resource sharing, and discussion. And I'm going to go over just a few slides about how to, first of all, join the community, and then some screenshots of what the community looks like so that you have a better idea of how to navigate it once you're within the community. And again, there is the link to join the community. It is http://community.betterhighschools.org. And first of all, you need to join the community, and there's a Join and Learn More form. And then you'll be receiving an email verification from the NHSC community address that has your password, when you can then navigate back to the website and click Login and then enter your username and password and join the community. Within the Community of Practice, the National High School Center currently has 2 groups, and we have one that's on high school tiered interventions. We also have one on early warning systems, and we'll soon be having one on college and career readiness. But all of the information from today's webinar will be focused and highlighted in the high school tiered interventions group. So here's what the page looks like when you first go to the community, the online community of practice. And you'll see the blue arrow right here for joining and learning more. That's the form that you'll have to fill out to get that information. Once you have your username and password, you'll then be able to go back and click the Log On Now button. And then once you've logged on, you'll see that under this Group tab, that's where you'll see information, and you can then specifically navigate to the High School Tiered Interventions Online Community of Practice. And that's what this page looks like. On June 7th, we will have the live chat. We will have a link to it right here at the landing page for the High School Tiered Interventions group within the community. It will have an icon that you can click on to be able to join the community of practice. Other aspects within the community, though, we do have resources that other
Jenny, you just cut out, so we're not hearing you right now. Okay. Well, I think we may have lost Jenny, but you can see that if you want to download some of the resources that we have on the Community of Practice, you can click on the Tiered Resources tab within the Community of Practice, and you can also upload your own. And so if you have a presentation or an example of a schedule that you'd like to upload, we'd love to have you upload it there. And then you can also see we have a Tiered Discussion tab, and that's where we're going to continue the discussions from this webinar. And so we hope that you go there, and you can also start your own discussion with whatever question that you have. So you can throw it out there, and either the presenters from today's webinar will respond, or National High School Center staff will respond, or members of the community will respond, and you'll be able to hear how others are dealing with the same issue that you are. You can see on the right side of the page, you can create a discussion. Once you click on that Tiered Discussion tab, you can click the blue button that says Create, and that will create a new discussion. And it'll put the title of your discussion up at the top in blue, and then a description below. And then once you open each discussion, you'll be able to add a new comment. So you'll be able to comment on whatever discussion has been put in there. And we do suggest that if you're new to the community or you're just starting to figure out how to navigate it, that you watch some of our how-to videos that are posted there. You can watch how to navigate the high school tiered interventions community of practice. That'll show you how to get from page to page. You can also watch how to start, view, and respond to a discussion in the high school tiered interventions community. You can watch how to upload a resource in the high school tiered interventions community of practice. So hopefully you can use those resources to better navigate and communicate through the community. Jenny, are you on there? Okay, so thank you.
I am. I was able to get back on. Sorry, I got kicked off by the conference call.
Okay.
So we just wanted to, we know we're at the closing time, we just wanted to again thank Brenda and Daphne for joining us today and sharing their perspectives and their experiences and what they've been doing in Colorado. We hope to see you on the Community of Practice soon. And if you have some of the questions that we've seen here in the question and answer, we'll be moving those over to different discussion threads within the online Community of Practice. Thank you very much, and have a good remainder of your Friday.